Right. Good morning. Everybody good? Two quick notes before we actually go into the text that Olivia has read for us. Ridden. I made a word up, man. The words that she read for us will be our text this morning. But let me begin by first saying two things. Number one, happy Father's Day. And it is interesting that we'll be talking about spiritual fathers as we go into this Father's Day. So we are thankful for you men who are loving and caring for children. And I would even venture to say that goes beyond you who are biologically fathers. Your roles in those ways sometimes extends beyond. Some of you are school teachers, and what you do for those kids, absolutely. Your role models and mentors, even as we have children milling about in here, some of them are yours and you're fathering them, and some of them are not yours and you're still serving a father role. So thank you. Enjoy the day. The other thing I just want to mention briefly is just happy Juneteenth. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with Juneteenth, but tomorrow is June 19th, and it's actually a commemoration of the last slaves who were made aware of their freedom at the end of the Civil War. And, just that whole tragic history culminating in freedom, sometimes I feel like it reflects our tragic history of lost in sin, slaves to sin, and set free in Christ. We even sung about much of that this morning. And so thank you, Gene and Rachel, as you led us in that. So happy June 19th. Anybody get off work tomorrow for that? No. Oh, somebody does. Well, good. Enjoy your day off while the rest of us are working. If you do have your Bibles, I would really encourage you, open those up to 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we're going to kind of look through these verses that Olivia read for us, verses 17 through 25 this morning, and think through a continuing emphasis of honor, very practical stuff. And today it will be based on honor towards those who are elders among the people of God. Back in January of this year, Lifeway Research put out an article that was a follow-up on a Gallup poll that was taken. It was a Gallup poll that's taken annually. They've been doing it for 50, 60, 70 years. In this Gallup poll, what they do is rate the ethical temperature of our assessment of persons in society. Pastors and clergy, those who in our text today are referred to as elders, were included in this poll starting in 1977. So we're talking about, 45 years of data recorded there. And sad to say, in 2023's Gallup poll, the trust in the ethics among those who are pastors, clergy, is at a record low. Only 34% of those who were polled rated the honesty and ethical standards of those who are clergy as high or very high. Now, this ranged in the mid to low 60s as recently, certainly in the 80s and 90s, and even as recently as when 9/11 happened. Some of you weren't even born, you don't know 9/11, but 9/11, 2001, it ranged up at 64%. There has been a downward trajectory ever since then. No doubt, this esteem of the ethical and honesty, the ethical standards and the honesty among those who are clergy has been rocked by things such as the sexual scandals that came out in the Roman Catholic Church early in this particular century. And frankly, it's come out in other denominations, including our own, more recently. Do you hear that? A 30% drop in roughly 20 years. Go along with that. Less than half, only 45% of people in the poll said they think and regard pastors as average in their honesty. If you really want some perspective, they did this poll with 18 different professions. Ahead of pastors were persons like, and some of you will fit here, nurses were number 1, doctors number 2, pharmacists number 3, high school teachers were number 4, police officers, accountants, and judges even are ahead of pastors. If you want to feel good about your elders, they did come in ahead of lawyers, car salesmen, members of Congress, and telemarketers. What is wrong? Why is there this decline in the estimation of the general public with regards to those who are their spiritual leaders in their churches? And how does that information interact with the text that's in front of us today? We're glad each and every one of you are here. We are so happy to see you. I know some we're in and out. Some of you are new. It's your first time. We're so glad you're here. So let me catch us up a little bit on what the context of what's happening in chapter 5 of 1 Timothy is saying. You see, this is a personal letter. It's a letter written by Paul to an individual by the name of Timothy. And it was a letter to help Timothy to understand how to lead, how to correct, and how to be faithful in the administration and the service of leadership within the church. Specifically in relation to what we're talking about today, back in chapter 3, there were instructions given about these leaders, these elders or overseers as it's called back in chapter 3. It speaks about their call, it speaks about their character, it speaks about whether or not they're competent to actually carry on this role, and it actually talks about their home life, no less. But as we get to the end of this letter, there's a shift to practicalities. And here, specifically, there's some instruction that's going to be given to the body as they care for those who are shepherding them. It's a little bit of a flip. And actually, there's going to be a little piece of personal advice that's thrown in there. So, as we look at this text, we're going to divide it into 3 sections. Verses 17 through 18, we're going to actually look at the appreciation due to the elder. Verses 19 through 21, we'll think through the accountability that is incumbent upon the elder. And then in verses 22 through 25, he's going to discuss a little bit about the appointment of those who will be elders. So an appreciation for elders, accountability of elders, and the appointment for eldership is what we're going to think through. So looking there in your Bibles in verse 17, it says, "Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor." Honor. It's the same word that was used back earlier in the chapter. Remember, it was honor the widows. It's the same word that's going to be used next time we gather in this text in chapter 6 about honor those who are masters or those who are your employer or those who have that employment type authority over you. What does this word honor mean? It actually says, first of all, that these guys should have double honor. There's many questions there. Is this meaning that in the same context as honor with the widows before, who should be cared for in their daily needs? Does this mean the elder needs to get twice as much as they get because maybe they care for a family or something of that nature? We're not really sure. I think we would be more inclined to say that this idea of double honor is 2 specific things. Number 1, it's a genuine respect for. And then number 2, it's a remuneration of. It's a responsibility to care for the physical needs of those who are providing for the spiritual needs of those who are under their care. It says that this needs to be done to those who rule well. That is, those who have the direct care over the current affairs and the superintending and the protection and the guarding of those who are the members of the church. If they do this well, they need to be honored. The best illustration that comes to my mind, and again, y'all forgive me sometimes, but sports illustrations work well in my head. I hope they will for you. But we're here in Durham, and I don't know if you remember, but I think it was just a year or so ago, maybe 2, that The head coach for Duke University basketball came to the end of a 4-decade tenure. Coach K had been the coach for 4 decades. He had multiple national championships. And on that last game, the game which, by the way, they lost to UNC, but on that last game, over 100 of his former players showed up to Cameron Indoor Stadium to honor him. I think it captures the idea of honor. It's a man who has, for decades, ruled well, led well. And out of that comes this respect for him. And it's just person after person after person. And it's saying that there needs to be this kind of appreciation for those who have authority over you as elders within the church. Now, he moves not just to respect, though. A pat on the back is fine, but he actually gives some examples of why. And he refers to agricultural examples. So if you want to think of, maybe it's not the most flattering thing, but if you want to think of your pastors as animals or farm laborers, fine. But those are the illustrations he uses. He uses quotes, one from Deuteronomy, which is out of the law, and it basically says this: the reason you need to appreciate and honor them with double honor is that, first of all, Deuteronomy 25 says, if an ox is treading out the grain, you should not muzzle him. Do any of those words make sense to you guys? Do you know what an ox is? An ox is like a massive cow, but he's not just a cow that's put out to eat grass and we eat him later. It's a cow who works. That's the ox. Do you understand what treading out the grain means? They would take these oxen and they would fit them with what's called a yoke. And basically it was an instrument that was put on their shoulders so that they, with their great strength, could actually do great hard work. And they would use them at the mill where there's a stone. And they'd bring the grain and put it between the stones, and the ox would go around in circles, and it would grind that grain down into flour so that we can use it to make bread and stuff like that. Do you know what a muzzle is? If you've got a dog and you've had to take him to the vet, you might understand what a muzzle is. A muzzle is something you put over the mouth of the animal. With a dog at the vet, we're probably trying to keep them from biting. But those who would do such to an ox who's treading out the grain, what are they preventing that ox from doing? From eating. The thing that here is specifically, we don't want them to eat. He's treading out this grain. There's grain now out in this area. And what the text is saying, if you've got an ox who's doing that kind of work for you, let him eat. This is rationale and reason for why those who are pastors in churches do have a right to remuneration. They're working to provide food. They should be provided food in the process. The second illustration is actually a quote from Jesus, from Luke chapter 10, where it says the laborer deserves his wages. It's not Jesus just coming up with it. There's Old Testament concepts with this too in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. But the one where Jesus says it, what he specifically says is to his 72 disciples he sends out to carry the message of the kingdom. Hey, don't take any provisions with you. When you come to a house that's a house of peace, eat whatever they put before you and take the shelter that they provide for you. So, point number one here, there needs to be an appreciation of elders with double honor, respect, and remuneration. Point number two, in verses 19 through 21, there needs to be an accountability for the elders. It's actually going to speak to, first, we talked about those who rule well. Well, it's incumbent to realize some don't rule well. So problems are going to arise, and sometimes it arises with church leaders. Here's what the text ends up telling us. It says there, do not admit a charge. By charge, it doesn't mean electrical shock. It means don't let an accusation of wrongdoing, don't let it come up against an elder except by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. You can probably hear some of our own judicial jurisprudence type thought concepts here. You bring witnesses that bring charges. And Back in Deuteronomy chapter 19, this precedent is laid down and now has application within the church. It's applied here as a truth and a principle for the elders. Let me just go ahead and say this. It's actually a truth and a principle for all of us. It says, don't let a charge come without there being 2 or 3 witnesses. You see, there are malicious persons out there. And by malicious, that means they wish to do ill or do bad for someone else. And what's one of the easiest way to do bad for someone else? Ruin their reputation. Spread lies about them. Gossip. And so in order to protect those who put themselves forward in a position of leadership from such malicious attack, there's a provision given here. Your accusation is only credible when you come with 2 or 3 credible witnesses against this person. So bring your charge to that person. We see this in Matthew chapter 18 as well. It goes to individual interactions, but it also works its way out into interactions within the church. That if you have a charge against somebody, go to that person individually. And if they repent, if they change and move the other way, you've gained a friend. If they don't hear it, go with what? 2 or 3. And then as this text says, it says in Matthew 18, if they refuse to hear 2 or 3, then, and that would be the idea of persisting in sin mentioned here, then have them rebuked before all. Now for some this sounds harsh, does it not? It's like shaming. We're going to bring you up and see if we can't humiliate you. But that's not the idea. The idea is that the person who's been set forward in public ministry on platform, when they commit sin and are persistent in it, it's going to require public address. To not address it and allow the persistence in sin to continue, what do you see that doing to the people out there that they're serving? Can you imagine? There's a couple of things. Number one, it's going to discourage the ones who want to live honorably. Wait a second. I know that the scriptures say this is how we're to live. We're to be honorable and not lie, and yet you as a leader are consistently lying. That's frustrating. But the other part to it is not only does it frustrate those who want to do right, but it emboldens those who want to do wrong. If he can do it, so can I. What's holding me? I mean, it must not be anything wrong. The leader of the church is doing it. So let's just go. And it says if they persist in that sin, you need to bring them before all. There's a couple of implications in that too. Do it without partiality and prejudging, it says there. This is so practical. How many times do you see, like maybe in your own family dynamic, your mother, I'm going to pick on a mom, or let's say your father, it's Father's Day. Your father will sit there and talk about all the people outside the family who do a certain thing, got divorced. How could they do that? I don't understand that. How could they do that? Until it's their child. And all of a sudden, when it's their child, we just give excuses and we cover it up and we actually embrace it. You understand what I'm saying? You ever seen that? There's a partiality in the way that that father is handling the sin of somebody within their own family. And they're saying, look, you can't do that. If you have an elder who's committing sin, be it with finances, be it with his honesty, be it with whatever, you have to judge that person without partiality. They come without an expectation of they are automatically guilty because the accusation was made, but they also are held accountable if found to be guilty, just like anyone else would be. So do you see there's a tension here? There's a two-sidedness to what's going on. This accountability is going to protect the one who's the leader from false accusations just because somebody wants to hurt them. But it's also going to protect the body against a leader who would abuse their position of authority and leadership in order to live like they want to. So we've got two things with our practical instructions here. Number one, you need to appreciate those who are your elders with double honor. Number two, you need to hold accountable those who are your elders. Hold accountable in that you have their back when things don't go well and somebody brings a false accusation, but also if they are guilty, then they need to step up and have the same treatment that any other person in the body would have. Number three, this leads Paul to give Timothy encouragement to take great care in the appointment of those who would serve as elders. He's actually going to just say great caution is necessary here. You see it there in verse 22. What does he say the timing of appointment to eldership should be? This does not go with the American motif of go, get it done. No, it says do not be hasty. Don't be short. Don't be quick. To do so, pointing back to the thing of accountability. If the person you appoint is appointed so quickly that they haven't had their character vetted and you haven't heard the Spirit's leading and putting them in that position, when they sin, there's a measure in which you and I join in that sin. You following what I'm saying? There's a responsibility we have as we put them in that position to make sure we vetted well before we put them in that position. A lack of caution brings responsibility on those who commission the one to lead us for the actual sins of the one who leads us. What's the rationale that Paul's going to use here in these 4 verses regarding this? Rationale number 1 in verse 22 is this: personal purity in that leadership is needed for ongoing kingdom ministry. He says, don't take part in their sins. Keep yourself pure. Here's something I think is backwards from a lot of our understandings of the way leadership works. The church does not belong to the preacher. It's Christ's church. The one who is the preacher or the pastor or the elder, they're just a steward. You do realize, how long has the church since Jesus been going on? I mean, we could argue even in the Old Testament. But since Jesus, we've got 2,000 years of the church going. It didn't start with us, and it won't end with us. We have a stewardship given to us. This is Christ's church to care for. And there will be an ongoing church after all of us are dead and gone, even the youngest among us. We need to live in such a way that we bring honor upon Christ's church, not just gain for ourselves from Christ's church. There's a generation to generation responsibility here. And so we want to keep this thing pure for the ongoing kingdom. There's another point that he makes in not being hasty, and that's in verse 25. In verse 25, what he's going to tell us is this. He's going to essentially say that, verse 24 and 25, he talks about the sins of some are conspicuous, which is just a fancy word to mean that's right there in front of you. Yeah, I can tell you're a bad person. Or sometimes it's hidden, and you don't find it out till later. Just like good works. Sometimes they're right out there in front of you. I can tell, man, look at you. Or sometimes you don't even know it until much, much later. Here's the truth that we see in those 2 verses. Time is the revealer of the hidden heart. So be cautious in putting persons in positions, because here's what you need to make sure you avoid. Smiles and syrupy flattery, that all melts away when the circumstances get hard. If selfless sacrifice is called for the one who is in the leadership position, the elder, the pastor, and there's sin within the heart that's just self-serving, it's going to come out. They're not going to serve you. They're going to serve themselves. They're not going to submit for Christ. They're going to make sure that I get mine. And burn the bridges behind me if need be. These things always come out. So we need to take time and not be hasty when appointing persons to these positions of leadership. Now I'm going to throw out to you this. There's a verse in here, verse 23, that you're like, where did that come from? A lot of commentators have struggled with, why does he sit here and talk about, Timothy, how you need to take wine for your stomach's sake in the midst of telling us about the accountability and not being hasty with, why in the world does he throw that in there? Well, again, we're not actually sure, but in context, here's what we would propose to you. That the charge upon Timothy and the charge upon elders is hard, unsettling work. Dealing with people's mess is difficult. And actually, over time, can be physically debilitating. So, as an aside, when Paul is telling Timothy about this whole thing of like this responsibility of laying on hands to appoint someone to be an elder and of keeping yourself pure and don't make a mistake in this, can you feel the stress inside if that's your job? So Paul's going to give some personal advice to Timothy, and he tells him, take a little wine for your stomach's sake. Now make sure we don't use this and abuse this. It's not, you need to take wine so you can just escape the moment. Let me go just obliterate my brain. I'm tired of this pressure. I mean, we've already read back in chapter 3, you remember that the elder is not to be given to much wine. The same thing for the deacon. They're not to be addicted to much wine. However, in the ancient world, wine was often used for medicinal purposes. And I want to just tell you, stress wears on the physical person, not just the spiritual person. So medical resources and responses are appropriate at times. So let's bring it to today. If you needed NyQuil with a little bit of that wine substance in there in order to help sleep one night when you're sick because you just are overly fatigued, it's okay for you to take some NyQuil. Or let's go to here. What if you need some advice, some counsel? Just because you're the pastor of the church doesn't mean you know everything. It doesn't mean you have all wisdom. So counsel, not only for what do I do with my church, but what do I do with my own life? What do I do physically? Is an appropriate response. And frankly, taking a break is an appropriate response for an elder. I know I've heard one person who has people come in and they've got these spiritual concerns, and his first angle of counsel is to ask them, how have you been sleeping? You need to go home and you need to sleep for 9 to 10 hours a night for a week and then come back and we can talk about the spiritual issues. So just know, church, know this. To lead a church of persons spiritually and have that weight upon you is a heavy, heavy burden. And you need to take care of those who are your pastors, even as in your own life you have heavy burdens. And you need to make sure that you take care of the physical at the same time you're taking care of the spiritual. There will be suffering. There will be long nights. There will be times when you have to sacrifice for the sake of others. Absolutely. But for the long haul, there needs to be care for yourself in order to be able to care for others. Does that make sense? So, okay, fantastic. We know what to do with elders now, right? We know we need to appreciate them with respect and remuneration. We know we need to hold them accountable. We know that if accusations come, that needs to be credible, and if they resist, we need to deal with it with the body. We also know that when we go to appoint these guys, it is a heavy, weighty matter, and we need to do so with much care, much caution, much time. What does that mean for South Durham Church? I'm going to tell you right now, you have elders in your leadership here, and they have needs right now. But it's not just now. Like we said, the church is an ongoing ministry, so you need to prepare yourself not just for the elders who you have now, but what are you going to do for the elders in your future? A couple of pieces of advice. Number one, honor him. Honor him. If you want to get real practical, the remuneration is a big part of what this is in this text. So here's the practical, and this is so hard, and the reason I think our earlier surveys don't trust pastors. The church is not the place for you to go and make your millions. But the church should take care of the financial needs of those who serve her so that they don't have to worry about the bill pay in their life. If you want a rule of thumb for that, here's a good rule of thumb. Think through what is the basic average income of the people that make up your church body. Whatever the average, I don't mean the richest and I don't mean the poorest, the average. And what you provide for that one who's going to be the leader in your church should equal something in that realm. So hear this. Those who are going to serve as pastors should never enter that vocation to get rich. But it's also not the church's responsibility to keep them poor. Does that make sense? So honor here has a very tangible aspect to it. Piece of advice number 2, hold him accountable. Hold him accountable. Now look, that carries 2 ends to it. The first holding accountable is have his back. If petty complaints come, and I promise you, they will. If you live long enough with anyone in your house, I guarantee you, petty complaints end up coming forward. So in the house of God, it's just compounded by many different people with many different perspectives. Petty complaints, you're not going to like something he did. Either the way he said something or what he wore or the car he drives or whatever. I don't know. You'll pick something. So they're going to come. And it's the church's responsibility to stop slander and gossip from people that come at those persons that's unfounded. Does that make sense? By the same token, be humble and honest in pointing out sin. So, now let me make sure we understand this. Your pastor is not Jesus reincarnate. He's a human being. He's a sinner just like you. He will disappoint and actually do wrong. So lovingly confront that person when needed. And when you do it with an expectation that their heart is going to be soft and receptive and contrite and ready to repent. You're helping that brother. If, God forbid, the one confronted that's the leader in the church is resistant, then we have to humbly care for the church as a whole. And the health of the church has to come over the fear of embarrassment that might come with this being brought forward. This is why all the cover-up has occurred and all the scandal and slander and sludge and yuck that comes when it actually breaks out. It also must be done without a favoritism because that's my guy. I love him. Oh, he's so good up there in the pulpit, or he's He's fun to have. Man, he knows how to raise money. We just need him for us to survive. No. Health of the church will come before his esteem if he's resistant. Does that make sense? Along with this holding accountable, let me just say this part. Because it's easy to start looking up at the front at the guy. It's easy to point at the president of the United States or the governor of the state or the head of the school board or the principal at the school and say it's all them. Let me just say this. In holding accountable, watch yourselves. Let's all watch ourselves. The call for holiness is not just for preachers. It's for everyone. So avoid being sucked into the sin of others, to the sin of either the pastor that needs to be reproved or of the disgruntled member who needs to be reproved. So this warrants not just honoring him and not just holding him accountable, but it also warrants this: be patient. That's the last thing I would just encourage from this text. It says, do not be hasty in the laying on of hands. Be patient. It takes time to ensure the vetting and the leading of the Spirit when putting forth persons to be leaders in the church. So some of you may actually have aspirations and say, I would love to be a leader in the church. That is it says in chapter 3, it's a noble thing to desire that. But if your desire is going to be mixed with, you got to give it to me and give it to me now, we probably all need to help you to just take a chill pill and be patient and wait and understand there's a lot of growth that needs to probably happen in you and a lot of evidence of that growth that needs to be seen by those that you'll serve. Does that make sense? So be patient. Give it time and pray. Pray. You need the Lord's provision here. South Durham needs the Lord's provision here. The church in general needs the Lord's provision here. This patience is important because, look, there's sins that sometimes aren't very easily recognized. When you run in, you get burnt 6 months, a year, 2 years later when it comes out what that guy's really like down in his character. So ask God to help. Ask God to lead. Ask God to guide and show you. I'd point out, and it's just a page or two over, in 2 Timothy chapter 2, as Paul is talking to Timothy there, he ends up giving him instruction. And he says, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust that to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. It's a heavy responsibility. It's a very practical responsibility. God is gifting the church with leaders, and the church has responsibility to appreciate them, to hold them accountable, and to appoint them with great care.